In the narrow confines of a German dugout, 15 meters below the surface of the Western Front, a raiding party has just descended through the entrance shaft. The occupants, perhaps 6 or 7 men, have seconds to react. The first American soldier through the entrance carries a Winchester Model 1897 pump-action shotgun. He holds the trigger down, works the pump action once, and the weapon fires. He pumps again without releasing the trigger. It fires again, and again, and again. In less than 3 seconds, he has discharged 6 rounds of double-aught buckshot into a space no larger than a standard bedroom. Each shell contains 9 lead pellets, each roughly 9 millimeters in diameter. At a range of under 10 meters, the spread is tight, the velocity devastating. 54 lead balls have just filled the air of that dugout. The first man takes multiple pellets to the chest and face. The second loses his jaw and part of his shoulder. The third, attempting to raise his rifle, is hit across the abdomen and groin. The fourth and fifth, packed together near the far wall, are struck by overlapping patterns of shot. The walls are now painted with blood. The air is thick with smoke and the acrid stench of burnt powder. Men are screaming, choking, dying. The entire action has taken less time than it takes to read this description. This was slam fire. This was the trench gun. And this was why Germany formally protested its use as a violation of the laws of war. The technique itself was simple, mechanical, and brutally effective. The Winchester Model 1897, like other pump-action shotguns of its generation, lacked a disconnector, the internal mechanism that prevents a firearm from discharging until the trigger is pulled again after cycling the action. In the Model 1897, if the trigger was held down continuously, the weapon would fire every single time the pump action closed and locked into battery. A trained soldier could empty the entire magazine in under 4 seconds, creating what amounted to a continuous roar of overlapping detonations. In the echoing stone and timber corridors of trench systems, in the low-ceiling dugouts packed with enemy soldiers, in the narrow communication trenches and sapheads that reached out toward no man's land, this turned a single shooter into a walking barrage. The Model 1897 had been designed for civilian use, for hunting and sport shooting, but its adoption by the United States Army in 1917 transformed it into something else entirely. Fitted with a perforated steel heat shield to protect the shooter's hand from the barrel after repeated firing, equipped with a bayonet lug to mount the standard M1917 bayonet, and fed with military buckshot loads specifically designed for anti-personnel use, it became the M97 trench gun. Other shotguns saw service as well. The Winchester Model 1912, the Remington Model 10, and even some older Spencer pump actions were pressed into military use, but the Model 1897, with its exposed hammer, its robust action, and its slam-fire capability, became the weapon most associated with American trench warfare. The effect of buckshot at close range is not a matter of speculation or propaganda. It is a matter of physics and anatomy. A single pellet of double-aught buckshot, traveling at over 400 meters per second, carries enough kinetic energy to penetrate deep into human tissue. At ranges under 10 meters, where most trench fighting occurred, the shot column has not yet had time to spread significantly. The 9 pellets are still tightly grouped, striking an area roughly the size of a human hand. The result is not 9 separate wounds. It is a single catastrophic impact zone where bone shatters, major blood vessels are severed, and soft tissue is destroyed. Multiply this by 5 or 6 rapid shots, and the effect becomes apocalyptic. Men were not simply killed, they were obliterated. German soldiers who survived encounters with American shotgun teams reported a level of trauma distinct from rifle or machine gun fire. Buckshot wounds did not produce clean through and throughs. They produced massive ragged cavities. Limbs were not perforated. They were partially severed. Faces were not wounded. They were erased. Medical officers on both sides recognized that buckshot casualties, when they survived long enough to reach aid stations, presented wounds that were functionally untreatable in field conditions. The shot scattered after penetrating the body, creating multiple wound channels, destroying tissue in unpredictable patterns, and leaving behind pellets embedded too deep and too numerous to extract. Men hit by buckshot in the torso often died not from a single catastrophic injury, but from the cumulative effect of a dozen or more separate penetrating traumas occurring simultaneously. This was not the mythology of war. This was the documented reality, and it was about to become the single most controversial weapon deployment of the First World War. The United States Army did not enter the First World War with any intention of using shotguns. When the American Expeditionary Forces began arriving in France in the summer of 1917, they carried the standard infantry rifle of the period, the M1903 Springfield, a bolt-action rifle chambered in .30 caliber. It was a superb weapon for open-field combat, accurate at long range, capable of precise fire, and built to exacting standards. It was also completely unsuited to the warfare that had evolved on the Western Front. By 1917, the war had long since descended into a brutal stalemate of trench systems, barbed wire, artillery bombardment, and close-quarters violence. The battles were no longer fought at 300 meters across open fields. They were fought at 3 meters in the darkness of underground bunkers. The rifle, with its length, its bolt-action mechanism requiring 2 hands to cycle, and its single-shot capacity between manual operations, was a liability in these conditions. A soldier entering a German dugout with a Springfield could fire once, perhaps twice, if he was exceptionally fast, before being overwhelmed by defenders with pistols, grenades, or improvised clubs. The nature of trench warfare demanded rapid, overwhelming firepower at point-blank range. The rifle simply could not deliver it. The solution came not from military theorists, but from practical field experience. American soldiers, particularly those assigned to guard duty, military police work, and rear area security, had been issued pump-action shotguns for prisoner handling and riot control. These weapons, never intended for frontline combat, began to make their way forward into the hands of raiding parties and assault units. The soldiers who used them reported something remarkable. In close-quarters engagements, the shotgun was not just effective, it was dominant. The reason was simple mathematics. A single shotgun shell, loaded with 9 pellets of buckshot, had the potential to incapacitate multiple targets simultaneously. In the tight confines of a trench or dugout, where men were packed shoulder to shoulder, a single shot could strike 2, 3, or even 4 enemy soldiers. The spread pattern, rather than being a disadvantage, became an asset. The shooter did not need to aim with precision. He simply needed to point in the general direction of the enemy and fire. At ranges under 20 meters, the buckshot pattern was wide enough to guarantee hits, but tight enough to remain lethal. For soldiers conducting night raids, moving through darkened trenches, or clearing fortified positions under fire, this was a game-changing advantage. Official adoption followed quickly. In September 1917, the United States Army Ordnance Department placed orders for shotguns to be issued to combat units in France. The specifications were precise. The weapons needed to be pump action for rapid fire. They needed to accept bayonets for close combat when ammunition was exhausted. They needed to withstand the mud, water, and physical abuse of trench warfare. And they needed to be available in large quantities immediately. The Winchester Model 1897, already in mass production for the civilian market, met all these requirements. By early 1918, thousands of trench guns were arriving at American supply depots in France. The weapons were not distributed army-wide. They were issued selectively to specific units and specific roles where their capabilities could be maximized. Military police detachments received them for guarding prisoners and supply lines. Trench raiding parties, the small assault teams, tasked with crossing no man's land under cover of darkness to attack enemy positions, were armed with them. Infantry units rotating into frontline sectors were allocated a limited number per company, typically issued to sergeants and experienced soldiers who would lead assaults into enemy trenches during attacks. Specialized guard units, responsible for protecting headquarters and communication centers, carried them. The shotgun was not a replacement for the rifle. It was a supplemental weapon, deployed in situations where its strengths could be fully exploited. Training for the trench gun was minimal but focused. Soldiers were instructed in the basics of pump-action operation, loading and unloading, immediate action drills for malfunctions, and safety protocols for bayonet mounting. But the real emphasis was on the slam fire technique. instructors demonstrated how to hold the trigger depressed, cycle the action rapidly, and maintain control of the weapon during sustained firing. The goal was not accuracy in the traditional sense. The goal was to fill a confined space with as much lead as possible in the shortest time. Soldiers were taught to aim low, toward the center mass of grouped targets, allowing the natural rise of the weapon under recoil to walk the pattern upward. They were taught to move forward aggressively while firing, using the psychological impact of continuous muzzle blast to suppress enemy resistance. They were taught that in a dugout or bunker, speed mattered more than precision. The units that carried trench guns into combat were not specially designated shotgun battalions. They were ordinary infantry formations, drawn from the same divisions that fought across the Western Front. The 1st Division, the first American unit to see sustained combat in France, had trench guns issued to its assault companies during the battles around Cantigny in May 1918. The 2nd Division, which included the Marine Brigade that would become famous at Belleau Wood, carried them during the brutal fighting in June. The 26th Division, a National Guard formation from New England, used them extensively during the Meuse-Argonne offensive in the autumn. The 42nd Division, known as the Rainbow Division, deployed them during the reduction of the Saint-Mihiel salient. The weapon appeared wherever American forces engaged in close-quarters fighting, and by the final months of the war, it had become a standard component of American offensive operations. The tactical employment of trench guns followed predictable patterns. During trench raids, small teams of soldiers would cross no man's land at night, cut through the enemy wire, and drop into German trenches with the objective of capturing prisoners, destroying equipment, or simply inflicting casualties before withdrawing. These raids were violent, chaotic, and brief. Time was measured in seconds. The soldiers leading these raids carried shotguns because they could clear an entire section of trench faster than any other weapon. The first man over the parapet would fire into the nearest dugout entrance or traverse, then pump and fire again, advancing while his comrades followed behind with rifles and grenades. By the time the Germans inside could organize a response, the Americans were already on top of them. Dugout clearing was where the trench gun truly demonstrated its value. German defensive positions on the Western Front were not simple ditches in the ground. They were elaborate fortifications with multiple levels, reinforced with concrete and timber, connected by tunnels and stairways that could extend 10 or 15 meters below the surface. Clearing these positions with rifles and grenades was slow, dangerous work. A single defender at the bottom of a stairwell could hold off an entire squad, but a soldier with a shotgun descending into a dugout could fire continuously as he moved, forcing the occupants to either retreat deeper or be caught in the open. The confined space amplified the effect. The muzzle blast alone was disorienting. The buckshot was lethal. German soldiers attempting to defend these positions found themselves facing an enemy who could put 50 pellets into the air before they could work a bolt-action rifle twice. Night patrols used shotguns for a different reason. Patrolling no man's land between the lines was among the most dangerous duties in the war. Patrols moved in near-total darkness, navigating shell craters, barbed wire, and the constant threat of enemy counter-patrols or sudden artillery fire. Contact with the enemy was usually unexpected, at ranges of 10 meters or less. In these conditions, the shotgun's ability to hit without precise aim was invaluable. A patrol leader encountering a German listening post in the darkness could fire by instinct, relying on the spread pattern to compensate for poor visibility. The enemy, hearing the distinctive boom of a shotgun rather than the crack of a rifle, knew immediately that they were facing point-blank fire. The psychological effect often caused German patrols to withdraw without engaging. Counterattacks after artillery barrages presented another ideal scenario for shotgun use. When American infantry assaulted German positions after preparatory bombardment, they moved across cratered ground toward trench systems that were disorganized, partially collapsed, and filled with stunned or wounded defenders. The advancing soldiers needed to clear these trenches rapidly before German reserves could arrive. Riflemen moving down a trench line had to engage each defender individually, clearing traverse after traverse in a slow, methodical process. Soldiers with shotguns could sweep entire sections in seconds, firing into each traverse as they passed, trusting the buckshot spread to catch anyone sheltering there. The speed of advance was dramatically increased, and the momentum of the assault was maintained. The documented accounts from soldiers who used trench guns and from those who faced them provide a consistent picture of their effect. American after-action reports from the summer and autumn of 1918 frequently mentioned the effectiveness of shotguns in close combat. Company commanders noted that assault teams armed with trench guns suffered fewer casualties during dugout fighting than those armed with rifles alone. Squad leaders reported that German soldiers, when confronted with shotgun-armed Americans in close quarters, often attempted to surrender rather than resist. Interrogation reports from German prisoners mentioned the weapon repeatedly, with some prisoners expressing outright fear of encountering it again. One report from an American infantry officer in the 26th Division, submitted after an assault on German positions near Seicheprey in April 1918, described a trench gun being used to clear a fortified machine gun post. The position, located at the junction of two communication trenches, was protected by sandbags and timber reinforcement, with a crew of 4 men and a Maxim gun. An assault team armed with rifles had attempted to take the position and been repulsed with casualties. A second team, led by a sergeant carrying a Winchester Model 1897, approached from a flanking trench and fired 6 rounds into the position from a range of approximately 8 meters. The machine gun crew was killed or incapacitated instantly. The sergeant then advanced into the position and found 2 crew members dead from multiple buckshot wounds, 1 crew member dying from wounds to the chest and abdomen, and 1 crew member severely wounded but alive, with extensive injuries to the face and left arm. The entire action had taken less than 15 seconds. German medical reports from field hospitals behind the lines provide clinical descriptions of buckshot wounds that corroborate the weapon's lethality. A casualty clearing station near Metz recorded treating multiple soldiers evacuated from the front with what the medical officer described as extensive pellet wounds inconsistent with shrapnel. The wounds presented as clusters of penetrating injuries, typically numbering between 4 and 12 per casualty, with deep tissue damage and significant blood loss. The medical officer noted that the wound patterns suggested close-range shotgun fire, and recommended that forward aid stations be prepared to encounter similar casualties. Several of these wounded soldiers died from their injuries despite medical intervention, primarily due to internal bleeding that could not be controlled in field conditions. A particularly detailed account comes from a letter written by a German junior officer serving with the 5th Bavarian Reserve Division in July 1918. The letter, later captured and translated by American intelligence, described an American trench raid on his unit's positions near Château Thierry. The officer wrote that American soldiers had entered the trench system at night, and that he heard a rapid series of explosions, louder than rifle fire, coming from the section of trench where his platoon was stationed. By the time he reached the area, the Americans had withdrawn, leaving behind 6 of his men dead and 4 wounded. The officer described the wounds as horrific, with one soldier having lost most of his face, another with his left arm nearly severed at the shoulder, and a third with massive abdominal trauma. He wrote that he had never seen wounds like these before, even after extensive artillery bombardment. He later learned from a wounded soldier who survived the raid that the Americans had been carrying short-barreled weapons that fired multiple times in rapid succession. The officer concluded his letter by stating that he hoped he would never face such weapons again. These accounts, and dozens like them, reached the German High Command through casualty reports, intelligence summaries, and prisoner interrogations. By the summer of 1918, German military leadership was fully aware that American forces were deploying shotguns in combat, and that these weapons were producing casualties that their field medical services were struggling to treat. The response was not tactical or operational, it was diplomatic. On September 14, 1918, the German government, through its diplomatic channels in neutral Switzerland, delivered a formal protest to the United States Department of State. The note was precise, legalistic, and damning, It stated that the use of shotguns by American forces constituted a violation of the laws of war as established by the Hague Convention of 1899 and 1907. The German government argued that shotgun projectiles, specifically buckshot, caused unnecessary suffering due to their tendency to produce wounds that were exceptionally severe, difficult to treat, and often fatal even when not immediately lethal. The note further argued that the use of such weapons was inconsistent with the principles of civilized warfare, and that Germany reserved the right to treat captured American soldiers found in possession of shotguns or the ammunition for such weapons as war criminals subject to execution. The legal argument rested on Article 23 of the Hague Convention, which prohibited the use of arms, projectiles, or material calculated to cause unnecessary suffering. Germany's position was that buckshot, by its nature, produced wounds far more severe than those caused by standard rifle ammunition, and that these wounds constituted suffering beyond what was necessary to achieve military objectives. The protest cited the medical reports from German field hospitals, noting the high mortality rate among soldiers wounded by shotgun fire and the extensive tissue damage that made treatment difficult or impossible. It argued that a weapon which routinely produced such wounds was inherently inhumane, and that its continued use represented a deliberate choice by the United States to employ means of warfare that violated international law. The American response was delivered on September 27, 1918, and it was unequivocal. The United States rejected the German protest entirely. The State Department's reply stated that shotguns were entirely consistent with the laws of war, that buckshot was no more inhumane than rifle bullets or artillery shrapnel, and that Germany's protest was without legal or moral foundation. The response noted that the Hague Convention's prohibition on unnecessary suffering applied to weapons that caused injury beyond that required to remove a soldier from combat, and that shotguns, like all firearms, served the legitimate military purpose of incapacitating enemy combatants. The reply further stated that the United States would not cease using shotguns, would not consider captured American soldiers carrying such weapons as anything other than lawful combatants entitled to prisoner of war status, and would hold Germany responsible for any violations of the laws of war committed against American prisoners. The American response also included a pointed counter-argument. If Germany wished to discuss violations of the laws of war, the United States was prepared to catalogue Germany's own conduct. The note referenced the use of poison gas, first deployed by German forces at Ypres in 1915, which had killed and maimed tens of thousands of soldiers through asphyxiation, chemical burns, and long-term respiratory damage. It referenced the use of flamethrowers, introduced by German assault troops in 1915, which burned men alive in their defensive positions. It referenced the aerial bombardment of civilian targets, the unrestricted submarine warfare that had killed non-combatants at sea, and the summary execution of civilian hostages in occupied territories. The implication was clear. Germany, having pioneered the use of chemical weapons, having deployed flamethrowers that immolated men in trenches, having killed civilians through deliberate bombing and U-boat attacks, had no standing to lecture the United States on the humanity of buckshot. The protest was rejected, and the matter was closed. American forces continued to use shotguns for the remainder of the war. No American soldier captured with a shotgun was executed, and Germany's threat to treat such soldiers as war criminals was never carried out. The diplomatic exchange, however, revealed something important. The weapon had provoked a response from the German government that no other American small arm had produced. The rifle, the machine gun, the pistol, the grenade, none of these had generated formal diplomatic protests. Only the shotgun had been deemed serious enough to warrant intervention at the level of international law. This was not because the shotgun killed more men than other weapons. Artillery killed far more. Machine guns killed far more. The shotgun's significance lay not in its total casualty count, but in what it represented. A weapon that, in specific circumstances, could produce a level of violence and trauma that exceeded even the baseline brutality of industrial warfare. The German protest also exposed a fundamental contradiction in the laws of war as they were understood in 1918. the Hague Convention attempted to draw distinctions between acceptable and unacceptable suffering, between weapons that were legitimate and those that were not. But by 1918, the Western Front had long since rendered these distinctions meaningless. Soldiers were being killed by high explosive shells that tore them apart, by machine gun fire that ripped through entire formations, by gas that suffocated them in their own trenches, by flamethrowers that burned them alive. In this context, the argument that buckshot caused excessive suffering was absurd. What the German protest actually revealed was not legal concern but tactical fear. The shotgun was being protested because it worked, because it was feared, and because German soldiers were actively attempting to avoid encountering it. This fear was not imaginary. It was widespread, documented, and based on concrete experience. German soldiers who had faced American shotgun teams in close combat and survived spread accounts of the weapon's effects through their units. These accounts, passing through the informal communication networks that existed in all armies, reached soldiers who had never encountered the weapon personally. Rumors began to circulate. The Americans carried a special weapon, a short gun that fired multiple shots at once, that could kill several men in a single blast, that was designed specifically for trench fighting. Some of these rumors were accurate, others were exaggerated, but the fundamental message was consistent. If you encountered an American with a shotgun in close quarters, your chances of survival were minimal. This psychological effect manifested in measurable ways. Intelligence reports compiled by American forces in late 1918 noted that German prisoners frequently asked about the shotgun during interrogation, often expressing relief that they had been captured by units not carrying them. Some prisoners stated explicitly that they would prefer to face rifle-armed Americans than those carrying trench guns. Others claimed that orders had been circulated in their units to specifically target American soldiers carrying shotguns, on the theory that eliminating these soldiers early in an engagement would reduce the overall threat. Whether such orders were ever formally issued remains unclear, but the fact that prisoners believed they existed is significant. It suggests that the fear of the weapon had reached a level where soldiers believed their own command structure was taking special measures to counter it. The fear was not limited to frontline infantry. German medical personnel encountering buckshot casualties at field hospitals recognized that these wounds represented a category of trauma distinct from other combat injuries. The scattered, multiple penetration nature of buckshot wounds made triage decisions difficult. A soldier with a single rifle bullet wound could often be assessed and treated quickly. A soldier with 8 or 10 buckshot pellets embedded in his torso, each having created its own wound channel, presented a far more complex medical problem. Field surgeons, working with limited time and resources, often had to make the decision that such casualties were beyond their ability to save. The survival rate for severe buckshot wounds was measurably lower than for equivalent rifle wounds, not because the weapon was inherently more lethal per hit, but because each hit involved multiple projectiles creating compounding trauma. Medical officers communicated this reality back to frontline units, reinforcing the perception that the shotgun was a weapon to be especially feared. The reputation of the trench gun extended beyond its immediate tactical effects. In the broader context of the First World War, where industrial-scale killing had become routine, where men died in their thousands in single artillery bombardments, where entire divisions could be annihilated in failed offensives, the shotgun stood out because it personalized violence in a way that other weapons did not. Artillery killed from a distance. Machine guns killed through volume of fire, gas killed invisibly, but the shotgun killed face to face, in confined spaces with immediate and visible results. The soldier firing a shotgun could see exactly what his weapon was doing to the enemy. The enemy soldier facing a shotgun could see the muzzle, hear the distinctive boom, and experience the impact directly. There was no abstraction, no separation between action and consequence. This immediacy, this raw directness, contributed to the weapon's psychological impact in ways that were difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. German propaganda attempted to exploit this fear by portraying the shotgun as evidence of American barbarism. Articles in German military newspapers described the weapon as a tool of savages, unsuited to civilized warfare, proof that American soldiers lacked discipline and honor. These propaganda efforts, however, were largely ineffective. The soldiers who had actually faced the weapon knew that it was neither barbaric nor undisciplined. It was simply effective. Propaganda could not erase the reality of what happened when a shotgun-armed American entered a dugout. The fear persisted, not because of misinformation, but because of accurate information. German soldiers feared the shotgun for the same reason they feared any effective weapon. It killed them. The psychological dimension of the shotgun extended to its use as a deterrent. American units that carried trench guns discovered that German forces, when aware of their presence, sometimes altered their defensive tactics. Intelligence summaries noted instances where German soldiers abandoned forward positions rather than risk close-quarters engagement with shotgun-armed assault teams. Trench raids conducted by units known to carry shotguns sometimes encountered less resistance than raids by units armed only with rifles. The weapon's reputation preceded it, and that reputation influenced enemy behavior in measurable ways. This was psychological warfare in its most practical form. The threat of the weapon was, in some cases, nearly as effective as its actual use. By the time of the armistice in November 1918, the trench gun had been in widespread use for less than a year, but its impact on the American war effort had been significant. It had not changed the outcome of the war. It had not won any major battles single-handedly, but it had provided American forces with a tactical advantage in the specific type of fighting that characterized the final offensives of 1918. Where German defenses relied on fortified positions, where combat devolved into close quarters fighting in trenches and bunkers, the shotgun gave American soldiers a tool that was objectively superior to anything else available. The casualty reports, the tactical assessments, and the reactions of both American and German forces all pointed to the same conclusion. In its intended role, the trench gun was devastatingly effective. The question of whether this effectiveness translated into exaggeration or mythology is worth examining. The trench gun's reputation, like that of many weapons, grew in the retelling. Stories circulated of single soldiers clearing entire German positions with shotguns, of enemy soldiers surrendering at the mere sight of the weapon, of buckshot penetrating body armor and fortifications that would stop rifle rounds. Some of these stories were embellishments, others were entirely fabricated, but the core reality, the fundamental effectiveness of the weapon in close combat, was never in dispute. The evidence was too consistent, too well documented, and too widely corroborated by sources on both sides of the conflict. What was exaggerated was the idea that the shotgun was a uniquely horrific weapon, that it produced casualties more gruesome than any other weapon of the war. This was demonstrably false. The Western Front was a place where men were killed in ways that defied description. Artillery fire could leave nothing of a man except scattered fragments. Flamethrowers reduced human beings to charred remains. Gas attacks caused men to drown in their own fluids. Against this backdrop of industrial-scale horror, the shotgun was not uniquely brutal. What made it notable was its effectiveness in specific tactical situations, and the fact that this effectiveness was recognized by the enemy to the point of formal diplomatic protest. What was not exaggerated was the fear it inspired. The documentary evidence, from prisoner interrogations to medical reports to captured correspondence, makes it clear that German soldiers genuinely feared the weapon. This fear was rational, based on observed outcomes and realistic assessments of the weapon's capabilities. It was not propaganda or hysteria, it was the natural reaction of soldiers who understood that encountering a shotgun in close quarters significantly reduced their chances of survival. The persistence of the shotgun's reputation beyond the First World War is also significant. When the United States entered the Second World War in 1941, shotguns were once again issued to military units, particularly to Marine Corps units fighting in the Pacific Theater. The experience of the First World War had demonstrated the weapon's value, and military planners saw no reason to abandon a proven tool. Shotguns were used in jungle fighting, in cave clearing on Pacific Islands, and in urban combat during the later stages of the war in Europe. The tactical lessons learned in the trenches of France were applied to the bunkers of Iwo Jima and the buildings of Manila. The weapon remained effective because the fundamental requirements of close quarters combat had not changed. Confined spaces, rapid engagement, multiple targets at point-blank range, these conditions still favored the shotgun over the rifle, just as they had 30 years earlier. The mythology surrounding the trench gun was further reinforced by its appearance in post-war literature and historical accounts. Veterans who had used the weapon in combat wrote memoirs describing its effectiveness. Military historians examining the tactical innovations of the First World War identified the shotgun as one of the few genuinely new weapon systems introduced during the conflict. Unlike tanks or aircraft, which were experimental and unreliable, the shotgun was a mature technology that was simply being applied to a new context. Its success was immediate and undeniable. This made it an attractive subject for historians seeking examples of effective military adaptation. Some myths, however, persisted without basis. The claim that German soldiers who captured American troops carrying shotguns would execute them on the spot was never substantiated. While the German protest threatened such treatment, there is no reliable evidence that it was ever carried out. German forces captured American soldiers carrying shotguns on multiple occasions during 1918, and in every documented case, these soldiers were treated as ordinary prisoners of war. The threat was diplomatic posturing, not operational reality. Similarly, the claim that shotguns could penetrate German body armor was exaggerated. German forces did use steel breastplates for certain assault troops, and while buckshot could potentially dent or deform such armor at very close range, it could not reliably penetrate it. The shotgun's effectiveness came not from armor penetration, but from the fact that most German soldiers were not wearing armor at all. Another persistent myth involved the range at which the shotgun was effective. Some accounts claimed that trench guns could engage targets at 50 or even 100 meters. This was false. The effective range of buckshot, even from a military shotgun with a long barrel, was approximately 30 to 40 meters at maximum, and lethality dropped off dramatically beyond 20 meters. At 50 meters, the shot pattern had spread so wide that only a few pellets might hit a man-sized target, and those hits were unlikely to be lethal unless they struck vital areas. The shotgun was a close-quarters weapon, effective at 10 to 20 meters, devastating at under 10 meters, and marginal beyond that. Its tactical value came from its performance at these close ranges, not from any imaginary long-range capability. The claim that the shotgun could fire indefinitely using slam fire was also misleading. While the technique allowed for rapid fire, it came with significant practical limitations. The barrel of a shotgun, particularly one with a military buckshot load, heated up quickly during sustained firing. After 6 to 8 rapid shots, the barrel became hot enough to affect accuracy and, in extreme cases, could cause ammunition to cook off prematurely. The heat shield fitted to military trench guns protected the shooter's hand, but did not prevent barrel heating. Soldiers were trained to be aware of this limitation and to pace their fire accordingly. In practical terms, a soldier could empty a 6-round magazine in slam fire mode, but attempting to immediately reload and continue firing at the same rate risked damaging the weapon or injuring the shooter. The technique was effective in short, violent engagements, but it was not a sustainable rate of fire for prolonged combat. The question of whether the shotgun actually violated the laws of war, as Germany claimed, is a matter of interpretation that depends on how one defines unnecessary suffering. By any objective measure, buckshot wounds were severe, often fatal, and difficult to treat. But the same could be said of wounds from artillery fragments, machine gun fire, and numerous other weapons that were universally accepted as legitimate. The fundamental issue was not whether the shotgun caused suffering, but whether that suffering was proportionate to the military objective achieved. The United States argued, and continues to argue, that it was. The shotgun removed enemy combatants from the fight, achieved tactical objectives, and did so in a manner consistent with the purpose of all military weapons. The severity of the wounds, while undeniable, was not in itself evidence of illegality. If it were, then virtually every weapon system employed in the First World War would have to be banned. Germany's protest must be understood in its proper context. By September 1918, Germany was losing the war. American forces, arriving in increasing numbers and equipped with modern weapons and fresh supplies, were contributing to offensives that were steadily pushing German forces back. The protest against the shotgun was not purely a matter of legal principle, it was also an expression of frustration, an attempt to limit American tactical advantages through diplomatic means since military means were proving insufficient. The fact that the protest was issued so late in the war, after months of American shotgun use, suggests that it was driven more by immediate military concerns than by abstract humanitarian principles. If Germany had truly believed that the shotgun violated international law, the logical course would have been to issue the protest immediately upon encountering the weapon in early 1918, not 6 months later when the war was entering its final phase. The irony of the protest, given Germany's own conduct during the war, was not lost on contemporary observers or subsequent historians. Germany had introduced chlorine gas at Ypres in 1915, phosgene gas shortly thereafter, and mustard gas in 1917. Each of these agents caused suffering that was prolonged, agonizing, and frequently fatal. Gas victims who survived often suffered permanent lung damage, blindness, and psychological trauma. Germany had pioneered the military use of flamethrowers, weapons that incinerated their targets and caused death by burning, smoke inhalation, or asphyxiation. German U-boats had torpedoed passenger liners, hospital ships, and merchant vessels, drowning non-combatants in the Atlantic. German forces had executed Belgian civilians as hostages, burned villages in occupied territory, and implemented policies of forced labor that resulted in thousands of deaths. Against this record, the claim that American shotguns represented a unique violation of humanitarian standards was absurd. The protest revealed more about German tactical concerns than about any genuine commitment to the laws of war. The reality, stripped of mythology and propaganda, was straightforward. The shotgun was an effective weapon for a specific type of combat. It excelled in situations where engagement ranges were extremely short, where multiple targets needed to be engaged rapidly, and where the consequences of failing to neutralize threats immediately were catastrophic. These conditions existed in trench warfare, and they would continue to exist in future conflicts involving urban combat, building clearing, and confined space operations. The shotgun's effectiveness in these roles was not a matter of opinion or interpretation. It was a matter of documented tactical outcomes. American units that used shotguns in close combat achieved their objectives faster, with fewer casualties than units that did not. This was why the weapon was adopted, why it was retained throughout the war, and why it would be used again in future conflicts. The trench gun's place in the history of the First World War is secure, not because it was the most important weapon of the conflict, but because it represented something that most other weapons did not. It was a weapon designed for a type of combat that military theorists had not anticipated, that generals had not planned for, and that soldiers had been forced to adapt to through brutal experience. The war that was supposed to be decided by massed infantry attacks and cavalry charges had instead devolved into a grinding struggle fought in mud, darkness, and narrow spaces, where visibility was measured in meters and engagements lasted seconds. In this environment, traditional weapons were inadequate. The shotgun, a civilian hunting tool pressed into military service, proved more effective than rifles that had taken decades to develop and perfect. This effectiveness and the fear it generated was why Germany protested. The protest was framed in legal and humanitarian terms, but its underlying motivation was tactical. German soldiers feared the weapon because it killed them. German commanders protested the weapon because it gave American forces an advantage. German diplomats argued against the weapon because military means of countering it had proven insufficient. The entire controversy was a recognition, however indirect, that the shotgun worked. It achieved what it was designed to achieve. It gave American soldiers a tool that was superior to anything the enemy could field in the same role. This is what battlefield effectiveness looks like, stripped of rhetoric and justification. A weapon is effective when the enemy fears it, when they attempt to avoid encountering it, and when they seek to have it banned. The trench gun did not change the outcome of the First World War. American victory was secured by industrial capacity, numerical superiority, the collapse of German allies, and the exhaustion of German resources. But in the final offensives of 1918, in the autumn fighting that broke the German defensive lines and led to the armistice, the shotgun played its role. It cleared dugouts that would have cost more American lives to take with rifles. It enabled assaults that might have stalled without it. It provided soldiers facing the most dangerous type of combat with a weapon that gave them a fighting chance. These are not dramatic contributions, but they are real ones. Soldiers who survived dugout assaults because their comrades carried shotguns did not care whether the weapon changed the strategic picture. They cared that it kept them alive. The broader significance of the trench gun lies in what it revealed about the nature of warfare in the industrial age. The First World War introduced weapons and tactics that made killing efficient on a scale never before seen. Machine guns could fire hundreds of rounds per minute. Artillery could destroy entire landscapes. Gas could incapacitate thousands of men simultaneously. In this context, the controversy over the shotgun seems almost quaint. 9 lead pellets fired from a pump-action weapon were supposed to be more inhumane than shells that tore men into pieces too small to identify, than gas that made them vomit blood while they suffocated, than flamethrowers that burned them alive in their defensive positions. The disconnect between the scale of industrial killing and the focus on the shotgun exposed the fundamental inadequacy of existing laws of war to address the realities of modern combat. The Hague Convention attempted to regulate warfare based on 19th century assumptions about honorable combat and proportionate force. The Western Front rendered those assumptions meaningless. What terrified German soldiers about the shotgun was not that it violated some abstract principle of warfare, but that it brought violence to a personal, immediate level. A soldier could survive an artillery barrage by sheltering in a deep dugout. He could survive machine gun fire by keeping his head down in a trench. He could survive gas by wearing a mask. But if an American with a shotgun descended into his dugout, there was nowhere to hide, no protection that would help, no tactic that would save him. The weapon worked at a range where he could see his enemy's face, where his own death would be witnessed directly, where there was no abstraction or distance to soften the reality of what was happening. This was the fear that drove the German protest, not humanitarian concern, but the recognition that German soldiers had no effective counter to this weapon in its element.